My son said, "Don't expect a dime from Dad's 92 million. At the will reading, he turned pale when he heard my name. She's still breathing? Thought she'd be gone by now. Maybe we should check her pulse while reading." That was the first thing I heard when I came downstairs, still wearing black, still smelling faintly of the roses from my husband's funeral. They had barely tossed the last shovel of earth before the family gathered back at the estate. Not for mourning, not for memories, but for the feast and the fortune. The hallway buzzed with voices, laughter, and the soft thump of shoes marching through what used to be my sanctuary. I stood at the foot of the stairs, gripping the banister my husband once polished by hand, and watched them divide up my life like vultures around a carcass. "This one's mine." My grandson slapped a neon green sticky note onto the grandfather clock, then the leather armchair, then the cabinet with our wedding china. He moved like a man in a showroom, claiming prizes he hadn't earned. His sister pointed her phone at the wall, an app open with blueprints and measuring lines. "We'll remodel this once she's out," she said to no one in particular. "Spa room, maybe. Definitely better lighting." I kept standing there. No one offered a chair. No one paused. Instead, my daughter-in-law appeared with a tray of champagne flutes. "We're celebrating Dad's legacy," she said cheerfully. "He built an empire, and now we get to carry it forward. And clean." "Out the ghosts," someone muttered. Laughter erupted. My chair at the dining table was gone, replaced with a folding one, dragged in from the garage. One leg wobbled, no cushion. They pointed me toward the mudroom instead. "You'll be more comfortable there, away from the noise." I sat in silence, facing a mop bucket and a broken broom with a paper plate of dry chicken and overcooked potatoes. No one noticed. No one looked. From the other room, I could hear them. "This house smells like mothballs and death," said one voice. "Let's strip the wallpaper and gut the kitchen." My grandson peeled off a bright orange sticker and slapped it onto the sideboard beside me. "This one's mine," he said, grinning, as if he'd won a prize at the fair. His sister walked in with her phone open, using some kind of room scanning app. "We'll remodel this once she's out," she said, turning slowly in place. "Spa room maybe, or a wine-tasting nook." They didn't whisper. They didn't even glance at me. I sat very still, holding my tea with two hands so it wouldn't shake. "Dad said she'd die before him," came another. "Guess that was his only mistake. She built soup, he built an empire," someone added, and the laughter grew louder. "Let her rot with the memories," a cousin sneered. "She doesn't even know what year it is. Can we keep her pension checks if we forward her mail for a bit?" my granddaughter joked. "God, she's half dead already," her brother said. "Let's just give her the Arden shed and be done with it." I took a bite of cold chicken. It tasted like chalk. I swallowed it anyway. I didn't speak, I didn't argue, but I reached into my sweater pocket and felt the crisp edges of the document I had kept safe for years. A bank memorandum signed and notarized, dated 15 years ago. It declared me as co-founder and early investor in the family trust. My name was there, inked in blue, not black, the kind of detail that matters in court. They didn't know. They never asked. Back then, when the company was drowning and bankruptcy loomed like a shadow, it wasn't lawyers or accountants that saved it. It was me. I sold every piece of heirloom jewelry I owned. My mother's emerald necklace, my wedding bangles, even the brooch I wore at our engagement party. I didn't tell anyone. I just wired the money and whispered to my husband, "Use it, but don't ever let them know it came from me." He didn't until now. I heard my son's voice in the next room. "We'll get the lake house. The boat's already under my name anyway." "The Lexus is mine," someone else called. "Dad said I could have it last Christmas." "I want the Hermes scarves," the youngest said. "Even if they're hers, she's not using them." More laughter. They were dividing up my skin while I was still breathing inside it. One of them walked into the mudroom, looked surprised to see me still sitting there, and said casually, There's bottled water in the garage fridge. Maybe grab one. You look pale." Then he left, not waiting for an answer. I stayed seated for another hour while they picked apart the art, the land, the memories. Someone even started dragging suitcases upstairs, claiming the master bedroom for the weekend. One of the girls asked if they could paint it pink. At some point, the champagne ran out and the music turned off, but the smell of greed still lingered, thicker than the dust on the drapes. I rose slowly. My knees ached. I steadied myself on the edge of the sink and looked out the small window above it. The roses my husband planted along the driveway were starting to wilt. No one had watered them in days. I wondered if anyone even noticed. I walked back into the house. Not that anyone asked where I had been. My footsteps were light, like the ghost they believed I already was. But I was not done. Not yet. I clutched the paper in my pocket, warm now from the heat of my palm. Let them drink. Let them decorate. Let them joke. The reading of the will was coming, and I had a pulse, a loud, steady, undeniable one. They look at me now like I'm a burden, a ghost, a shadow in their perfect story of success. But there's a chapter they erased because it didn't fit their version. The one where I saved everything and no one ever knew. 15 years ago, the company was crumbling. I remember the way my husband came home late, tie loosened, hands trembling, silence heavier than words. He didn't need to tell me. The bank had called. The numbers didn't lie. They were on the verge of losing everything. The clients, the contracts, even the house. "We just need one deal," he said, eyes fixed on the fireplace, like he could burn the shame out of himself. "Just one. If we can close with those investors in New York, it'll turn around." But there was a problem to lock in a deal. He needed collateral. Money he didn't have, and pride he refused to put aside. So I made a choice. That night while he slept, I took out the velvet box from the back of the drawer. Inside were the last pieces of my dowie, the diamond earrings from our wedding night, the emerald ring passed down from my mother, the heavy gold bangles I wore when I first came to this house as a bride. Every memory had weight, and I sold them all quietly, without asking, without telling. I wired the funds directly to the company's escrow account the next morning and told him only one thing: use it. Don't let them see you fall. He didn't ask where the money came from. He didn't want to. No, that was his way. Strong on the outside, silent on the inside. And I stayed behind the curtain. The deal closed 2 days later. The investors signed. The company lived. They called him visionary. They called him a self-made miracle. They never called me. But that wasn't the part that hurt the most. A month later, I saw the new branding materials. His face bold on the front page, a slogan underneath: "Legacy built alone." I smiled when I saw it, bit my lip, said nothing. But I remember everything. Even the night I wrote the IPO pitch by hand. He was preparing for another investor meeting and didn't know where to begin. The market was shifting, the industry was changing, and he was still pitching like it was 1995. So after everyone went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile and started to write. I outlined a multi-phase expansion strategy based on emerging trends, projected shareholder value, and a scalable growth model tied to supply chain reform. I had done it before in another life. Before marriage, before babies, before the business card that said homemaker. That night, I signed the document with a name no one would recognize. A pen name, something harmless, something clean, and the next morning, I sealed it in an envelope, stamped it, and mailed it to the office. No return address, just his name and the company's. He received it 2 days later. At dinner that night, he mentioned a strange proposal. Someone had sent anonymously. "It's brilliant," he said, laughing. "Even the handwriting looks familiar, like yours." I shrugged and kept stirring the soup. That proposal became the foundation of their IPO launch 6 months later. It brought in over $40 million, zero in new investments. They hung a plaque in the lobby, inspired by ingenuity. His ingenuity. But I didn't mind. Not then. I told myself the family needed one hero, and it was better to let him be it. It's funny the way women are taught to disappear gracefully, to take pride in being the anti-pill spine while someone else gets the face. We're told that quiet loyalty is noble, that sacrifice is strength, but silence too long becomes eraser. And now they walk through my house, taping their names onto furniture, speaking of legacy like I was never part of it. Now they laugh at my memory, question my mind, mock my usefulness. They don't know what I gave, what I built, what I hid. There's a folder upstairs in my closet, beneath the linens no one ever touches. Inside is the original draft of that proposal, ink slightly smudged from a night of restless hands. My pen name in the corner folded next to it is a letter from the patent office, one that ties the pitch strategy to a registered idea. Registered not under the company, but under me. I never cashed the royalty checks. They come quarterly, have for years. I never needed the money. I needed the quiet. I needed the dignity of knowing what I had done, even if no one else did. But now they've drawn a line in the sand. They said me shame. They stripped me of memory. They called me dead while I still breathed. So I've opened the folder again. I've spoken to the lawyer. I've hired the handwriting analyst. I've documented everything. Not for revenge, not even for justice, but for truth. Because when they sit in that room and the will is read, and they hear my name tied not just to the trust, but to the legacy they thought was theirs alone, there will be silence. For once, I will be loud, and not one of them will be able to erase me again. They didn't even look me in the eyes when they did it. It was a Tuesday, 5 days after the funeral. The house still smelled faintly of lies and pine from the casket spray. Someone had left the condolence cards on the piano, unopened, as if even grief was too inconvenient to process. But their energy had shifted. The mourning was over. Now came the sorting, the claiming, the clearing. And the clearing began with me. "We've decided it's best," Clarissa said, not bothering to lower her voice. "She can move to the small room downstairs." I blinked. "The laundry room." "Technically, it's a utility space," she corrected with a tight smile. "But there's room for a cot." My bedroom, our bedroom, was already gone. I could hear the laughter upstairs. Drawers pulled open, closet doors creaking. Someone was rolling a suitcase down the hallway. My perfume bottles, my silk scarves, my books, they were being packed into cardboard boxes. Not carefully, not lovingly, just removed. I shuffled slowly toward the stairs, only to see a label stuck to one of the boxes. Donation, another outdated. A third, old lady junk. They didn't even have the decency to hide the labels. Clarissa's husband, my son's son, was holding a clipboard and gesturing toward furniture like a man directing a moving company. "That end table's perfect for the cabin," he said to his wife. "Put a sticker on it." A neon pink post-it note appeared like a bruise on the oak surface. "This one's mine." I watched as my memory was claimed, piece by piece. The wedding. China, the rocking chair where I nursed my son through CRO. Even the old record player, the one we danced to during Blackout's, was now marked with the same cheerful tag. Clarissa turned to me with that sharp, polished smile she wore like armor. "She doesn't need a room," she said to the group. "Just a bed until she's gone." A few awkward chuckles followed. No one said anything. One of the younger boys, Ethan, I think, though I can't keep track anymore, whispered something as he passed by the kitchen door. If we keep her address, we can still cash her pension checks. They laughed at that one. I didn't. I simply walked slowly, knees stiff, to what used to be the laundry room. It smelled like bleach and mildew. A single bare bulb flickered overhead. There was a plastic mop bucket in one corner and a rusted utility sink. A cot had been pushed against the wall. No sheets, just an old moving blanket. That was to be my room. My suitcase had already been placed beside it. A dented thermos, a framed photo cracked in the corner sat on top. I picked it up. It was from our 30th anniversary. We were standing in front of the rose arbor, my husband's arm around me, my hand resting on his chest. Behind us, the house stood tall and proud. Back then, it had felt like ours. But now that same photo had been pulled off the hallway wall and stashed behind the refrigerator. I found it when I went to get some water face down, wedged between a broom and a box of expired granola bars. They didn't even want to look at it. Did they think I wouldn't notice, or did they think I'd forget? They forget that I remember everything. I remember the night my husband carved our initials into the porch rail. I remember the scent of cinnamon and vanilla on Christmas mornings. I remember holding my son as he wept over his college rejection, whispering, "You're still enough." I remember baking birthday cakes from scratch, driving to midnight rehearsals, hand sewing curtains to make this house feel like a home. But now I'm just a placeholder, a logistical burden, something to step over on the way to an inheritance. Clarissa stopped by my cot later that evening with a folded towel and a plastic bottle of unscented shampoo. "These are for you," she said, setting them down like charity. "We'll have dinner around 7. You can eat after we're done." I nodded. That's all I could do. That night, while they laughed over steaks and wine in the dining room, I sat on the cot, peeling open a tin of soup I'd hidden from the pantry. I had to use the end of a key to open it. No can opener had been left for me. "They say I built soup." That's what they whispered earlier when they thought I wasn't listening. "Dad built an empire," one said. She built soup. As if nourishment wasn't a foundation. As if warmth and care and sacrifice meant nothing because it didn't show up in a stock portfolio. I built soup, yes, but I also built them. And now they are tearing me down with giggles and tape. And tiny neon stickers. The cruelty is never loud. It's quiet, surgical, polite, but it cuts just the same. Later, when the house went still, I returned to the fridge and carefully pulled the anniversary photo back into my hands. I wiped the dust off the glass. I pressed it to my chest. This was once my home. I was once the heart of it. They may think they've erased me, but they've only reminded me of what I once gave and what I can still take back. And tomorrow, the lawyer calls and I will answer with the voice they forgot I had. It started with a folder, old, worn, leather-bound. I kept it beneath the loose floorboard in the laundry room, now my bedroom, behind a crate of mop heads no one ever touched. Inside were things they never thought to ask about, because they never asked about me. The morning after they measured my room for spa conversion, I took the folder and walked 2 blocks in the cold to the payphone outside the pharmacy. They'd cut off my cell service by mistake, but I hadn't forgotten the number. When Mr. Alden picked up, I simply said, "It's time." He didn't ask what I meant. He just said, "Come in tomorrow." Mr. Alden had been my husband's lawyer for decades. But what they didn't know is he had also been mine long before the marriage became a performance. Long before I faded into wallpaper and casseroles. The next day in his office, I laid out the documents one by one. First, the joint trust certificate. My name was right there, beside my husband's, not as a witness, not as a dependent, as co-founder, co-executor. Then the investment agreement from the First Savings Bank of California, dated 15 years ago. It clearly showed the deposit, my dowry, my mother's heirloom necklace, and the gold bangles from my wedding chest. I sold them all quietly when my husband's company faced collapse. The money bought him the merger that saved his firm. I never asked for credit. I only asked for him to survive it. Last, I slid forward. A bundle of handwritten pages, yellowed with time, corners curled. Each one bore a familiar slant of cursive. "It's the original proposal," I said softly. "The model for the IPO." Mr. Alden's eyes narrowed. "You wrote this?" I shook my head. "I sent it. I sent it with a pseudonym." He submitted it under his name. I remembered that night clearly. My husband had been pacing the den, a glass of scotch untouched on the mantel. His board had rejected every draft he'd shown them. I sat up in bed after he'd done that, gone to sleep, pulled out a pad of paper and wrote until dawn. By morning, my fingers were stained with ink. I never told him it was mine. I mailed it to our P.O. box with no return address. He presented it at the next board meeting as his own. They approved it unanimously. It made him $38 million, and I never said a word. Mr. Alden leaned closer. "May I?" He pulled out a file from his cabinet and removed a small envelope. Inside was another letter, typed, but signed L. Wrightwood, the same pseudonym I'd used on the handwritten version. I watched as he compared the signature. "Do you still write like this?" he asked. I nodded. He called in a specialist that very afternoon, a handwriting analyst from Stanford. They spent 2 hours together poring over loops and curves, pressure points and pauses. Later that week, the analyst sent a report. The letters were a match, 100% dot, and the original work contained intellectual property clauses. Copyright and authorship belonged to me. According to federal patent law, the idea, the framework for the IPO, was considered an invention. Because it had never been formally transferred and I could prove authorship, the royalty rights defaulted back to me. Millions, possibly more, depending on the duration of profit. All mine. Mr. Alden looked at me across the polished wood of his desk and said, "You understand what this means?" I nodded. "I don't want the money," I said. "Not all of it." "What do you want?" I folded the letter back into the folder and stood. "I want my voice back." And for the first time in months, I allowed myself to smile. A small, knowing smile that began in my chest and curled its way to my lips. They buried me while I was still thinking. They assumed quiet meant useless, that love meant absence, that motherhood meant surrender. They thought I'd faded like the wallpaper, but I was simply watching and remembering. I had not forgotten who I was. I was the girl who read contracts by candlelight while her husband slept. The woman who taught herself investment. Law with a borrowed library card. The mother who made soup, yes, but also decisions, smart ones. Now, as they tripped over each other to carve up a house I helped build, they had no idea the land beneath their feet bore my name, and the paper trail was already with the court. By the time they sat down at the will reading, it would all be ready. But first, I would let them have their party, their games, their jokes, let them dance around the ashes. Thinking I had already blown away with the wind, because they had forgotten me. And that was their last mistake. They made me sit at the end of the table, a folding chair, of course, because God forbid I ruin the aesthetic of their tailored wool suits and designer handbags with my old lady aura. The law office was modern, full of glass walls and leather trim, cold in every way. Outside, it was raining. Inside, it might as well have been snowing. My son Joseph sat nearest to the front, legs crossed confidently, wedding ring polished. His wife whispered something in his ear. He chuckled just loud enough for the room. "She'll be dead by next Christmas," he muttered, sipping from a complimentary espresso cup. "Don't expect a dime for her." My granddaughter was texting under the table. My grandson was practicing his signature on a legal pad. None of them looked at me. Mr. Alden walked in, briefcase in hand, and everyone straightened. He always carried the air of finality with him, a man whose voice usually meant the end of a question. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "Today we are here to execute the final wishes of Mr. Harold Brightwood, as stated in his legally binding, revised will." No one noticed the slight emphasis on the word revised. A few folders were passed out, some pages were turned, and then Mr. Alden reached into his case and removed a small silver voice recorder. He clicked it on. My husband's voice filled the room, slower than I remembered, more tired, but clear, calm, measured. "If my son ever speaks ill of his mother," he said, "deduce $1 million per word." Silence. The breath left the room like a vacuum had been turned on. The voice continued, "You know how many he owes." There was a moment of stunned stillness, followed by the clack of a pen falling from Joseph's hand. "What the hell does that mean?" he asked, sitting forward. "That's not real. That's not in the Mr." Alden held up one hand and slid forward a printed transcript. The heading read, Exhibit A, Verified PIU Transcript, Home Security System, Kitchen, 3 days after funeral. He turned the page. 1. She's still breathing. 2. Thought she'd be gone by now. 3. Check her pulse at the will reading. 4. She built soup. He built an empire. He kept going. 587184. Music total recorded statements. Deemed ill of his mother. 88. Mr. Eldon concluded that totals $88 million in deductions. However, some were rather colorful. The remaining $3,996,002 were subtracted as discretionary penalty, as per Clause 14C in Mr. Brightwood's addendum. He turned the final page. Remaining inheritance for Mr. Joseph Brightwood, $3,800,000. Joseph leapt from his seat. "This is insane. You can't do this. That woman, she's been a drain for years." Dad wouldn't. "He would," I said quietly. It was the first time I'd spoken all morning. Everyone turned. My voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Mr. Alden continued calm as ever. "Now, as for the primary beneficiary of the trust, the copyrights and remaining estate assets, Harold Brightwood has left them to his wife, Eleanor Brightwood." He handed me the folder. It was heavier than I expected. Inside were the deeds, the portfolio transfers, the rights to the intellectual property tied to the IPO model. A second folder, smaller, held a deed to an apartment in Paris, and a letter handwritten. "My husbands, forgive me for the years I let your light stay hidden. I never forgot. I only hoped someday they would see what I did. If they couldn't, then let this speak louder than I ever could. You built this with me. Now let the world know your name." Joseph stood frozen. Face white. His wife began dialing someone, probably a lawyer, a therapist, a priest. I looked around at the room full of people who had practiced their victory speeches on the drive over. And I said nothing, because justice doesn't require noise. It just needs truth. I gathered my coat. It was the same old beige one they'd called depressing last Christmas. I walked slowly past Joseph, whose hand was clenched into a fist on the polished table. As I passed the coat rack, I turned to Mr. Alden. "Will that be all?" He nodded. "Enjoy Paris." And I did, but not before turning back to the family I had fed, clothed, shielded, and finally outlived. "You buried me while I was still thinking," I said, steady. Too bad I had one more idea left. The silence after the will reading wasn't just awkward, it was bone deep. But I wasn't done. Mr. Alden knew that. He motioned for the second envelope. "This," he said, unfolding the packet with gloved care, "pertains to an intellectual property matter not previously disclosed to the family." He laid a series of documents before the room. 15 years ago, shortly before Brightwood Industries avoided bankruptcy through a game-changing IPO strategy. An anonymous proposal was submitted by mail. The model presented in that proposal became the blueprint for the company's public offering. He turned to page 2. This patent was formally filed under a pseudonym, E.B. Sinclair, at the time assumed to be a consultant or anonymous strategist. Joseph raised an eyebrow. What does this have to do with anything? It was Dad's company, his plan. Mr. Alden calmly flipped to the 3rd page. It has everything to do with this, Mr. Brightwood, because we recently concluded forensic analysis on the original drafts of that proposal, including ink composition, handwriting comparison, and timing of postal submission. He slid a certificate across the table. The pseudonym was hers, he said, pointing to me. Your mother, Eleanor Brightwood. Gasps. Even the air in the room seemed to hesitate. This, he continued, holding up a framed certificate, is the formal recognition of Eleanor Brightwood as sole intellectual contributor to Patent 1-294-157B, also known as the Brightwood Stabilization Model. The patent now yields residuals through multiple licensing streams, amounting to $9,400,000 annually. Joseph's wife clutched her scarf. Catherine, my granddaughter, dropped her phone, but Joseph stammered. She made soup, she mended socks, and Mr. Alden allowed himself the faintest of smiles. Yes, and she saved your father's legacy. He pulled a folded letter from a separate envelope, slightly aged but still crisp. Before his passing, Mr. Brightwood left this personal note, sealed and notarized. He cleared his throat and read aloud. She found the cure before the world knew it was broken. She kept quiet because she loved me. I asked her to let me take the credit because the board wouldn't follow a woman. But I knew, I always knew. This company is her mind on paper. A sharp breath from the back of the room, the kind that belongs to someone realizing everything they thought they knew has cracked like old glass. Joseph muttered something under his breath. What was that? I asked, meeting his eyes. He looked up, finally looked at me. I didn't know, he said, voice quieter. I didn't know it was you. I didn't answer because I'd spent years erasing my name, so his father could be seen as whole. I'd kept my name off the plaque. I'd burned the drafts. I'd even mailed the final model from a different zip code. But I hadn't forgotten. Mr. Alden passed the room one last page, a ledger of every quarterly payout the patent had earned since inception. All signed to a holding trust, untouched, waiting heir, he said, handing me a black folder with gold trim. It's yours now. Catherine spoke up, her voice strangely small. So we were living off her mind all along? No one replied. They were all too busy, staring at their reflections in the glass walls, wondering how they missed the most important mind in the house. Because it was wrapped in an apron, I stood. They didn't stop me. Not this time. I drew the map, I said quietly, buttoning my coat. And you all thought it appeared by accident. No one moved as I left. The same woman who'd once been dismissed as furniture, as fading wallpaper, had just reminded them that empires rise on the backs of women too smart to be seen and too strong to be erased. They were given 48 hours. That's what the letter said. Signed by the executive, stamped by the court. A legal deadline for the ungrateful to vanish from the house they once trampled. By morning, the packing began. Boxes thudded down the hallway. Laughter for once was gone. Catherine didn't say a word. Her eyes were red, but her hands moved fast, sweeping jewelry into velvet cases that didn't belong to her anymore. Joseph tried. Please, Mom. That's all he could manage before his voice broke. I looked at him. This man who once sat on my lap to read the cereal box, who used to hold my hand during storms, now, reduced to a trembling shadow, asking for a second chance. I didn't cry. I'd done enough of that. I simply said, you spoke first. The will simply listened. He slumped back, as if the truth had struck him harder than any slap. Outside the kitchen, I heard his wife shrieking, "You're heartless. She's heartless." I stepped into the doorway. "No," I said. "I gave you a house. You gave me hell." She opened her mouth again, but I was done giving her my ears. I walked through the home slowly, gently, as if reintroducing myself to something sacred. The hallway still smelled faintly of old lemons and sunlight, but it was no longer cluttered with arrogance. I passed by the guest room, now emptied of its spa room fantasies and Pinterest plans. The little sticker on the vanity mirror caught my eye. "This one's mine." I peeled it off, folded it once, and tossed it into the trash. Room by room, I gathered them all. The blue one on the antique dresser, the yellow one on the armchair with my husband's teacher initials, even the green one on the silver frame of our wedding photo. "This one's mine," they had said. Not anymore. Not ever, really. They just thought kindness was consent. In the dining room where laughter once lived, I paused by the grand piano. Someone had placed a sticker there too. I closed the lid gently. "That one was always his," I whispered, "and he gave it to no one." The house felt still, not empty, just clean, as though it had been holding its breath for too long. And now could finally exhale. Outside, I stepped onto the back porch. The roses were gone, uprooted last summer for a wine-tasting corner. But the pomegranate tree still stood crooked beside the window, its roots stubborn, its bark split from too many summers. And there, near the base, was the little rose bush I planted when Joseph turned 5. Just one brittle stem remained, thorns bare, leaves curled, forgotten. I knelt down, knees against the cool tile. The ground was dry, bone dry. I fetched the watering can from behind the shed, half rusted, but still useful. I poured slowly, listening to the soil drink. As the water sank in, I whispered, "We bloom again." Because we would, not because they believed it, but because I never stopped tending the roots. The wind picked up then, brushing across the porch, carrying with it a strange silence, the kind that comes after a house has been reclaimed. This house wasn't haunted anymore. It was mine. I sold the house the following spring, not out of anger, not for revenge, just because it no longer felt like mine. Some places collect too much noise, and no amount of dusting can quiet what's been said inside the walls. With the sale finalized, I moved into a small penthouse near the sea in Santa Barbara. The kind of place with wide windows, white curtains, and the hush of waves always just a breath away. No squeaky stairs, no whispers behind doors, no stickers claiming what never belonged to them. Just peace and room for me to think out loud this time. The royalties from the patent continued to arrive. Steady and quiet, but I didn't need it, not all of it. So I started something new. A fund, a small foundation with a long name. Women Who Were Erased. It wasn't flashy. It didn't have a gala or a ribbon cutting. Just a bank account, a mission, and enough to offer scholarships, grants, and above all, recognition to women who had built silently and been forgotten loudly. I knew what that felt like. I knew how much it hurt to whisper brilliance into someone else's spotlight. And I knew how good it felt to take that spotlight back. Outside my front door, I hung a wooden sign. It was hand-carved from the old oak tree my husband and I once planted together. I'd kept a piece when the storm split it years ago. The sign read, "This house was funded by a burden. Enjoy the silence." It made the mailman chuckle every time. Inside, I didn't keep much, just essentials and a few memories. One of them, a faded drawing taped to the fridge, crayon on construction paper, drawn by my youngest grandson years before they taught him to roll his eyes at me. A stick figure of me in big glasses standing next to a giant light bulb. In bright purple scribble, it said to Grandma, You think better than Google. I'd nearly thrown it away once, back when they told me I was losing my mind, that my memory was slipping, that I should just sit, smile, and stay silent. But I didn't forget this drawing, and I never forgot how to think. They had buried me in assumptions, old, tired, fading, irrelevant, but I wasn't any of those things. I was patient. I was watching. I was remembering what they wanted erased. And most importantly, I was still thinking because I never stopped. They thought I was fading, but I was just waiting for the right moment to think out loud. If you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or pushed aside, just remember, your story isn't over until you decide it is. She was more than a mother, more than a wife, more than a woman in the background. She was the mind that built the map, and when they erased her, she rewrote the ending. If this story moved you, imagine how many others are still waiting to be heard. Subscribe to Grandma True Stories for more real tales of strength, justice, and the women who refuse to disappear quietly. Because silence may be golden, but truth, that's priceless.